A bitter old man hated his new neighbors the moment they moved in. But when the day came that he collapsed in his own yard, the last people he expected to save him were the very ones he despised. The street was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but alive with gentle sounds. Lawnmowers hummed in the distance, sprinklers hissed rhythmically over emerald lawns, and the laughter of children carried faintly through the warm air. The sunlight was golden soft and forgiving, slanting across rooftops and stretching long shadows onto the pavement. It was a picture of suburban calm, where every house seemed tucked into its place, every hedge neatly trimmed, every driveway swept clean dot at the corner. A moving truck had pulled up earlier that morning. By now, most of the boxes had been carried inside, though a few still sat stacked neatly by the walkway, waiting for their turn. A black family had just moved in, a father, a mother, and their young child. To anyone watching, there was a certain energy about them, not rushed or chaotic, but hopeful, as though the simple act of carrying furniture into a new home was part of something larger, something full of promise. The father moved steadily, a man of quiet strength, his shirt clinging slightly to his back in the afternoon heat. He balanced boxes with practiced care, never dropping a thing, his movements efficient yet unhurried. Every so often, he would pause to catch his breath and look toward the house with a small smile, as though imagining the life they were about to build inside it. The mother worked alongside him, graceful in her determination. She carried lighter boxes, dishes, books, blankets, but her real contribution was in the way she animated the moment with warmth. She would laugh softly when her child tried to help, dragging a pillow almost too big for their arms. She would call out gentle reminders, "Careful with that, sweetheart," her voice like a calming anchor in the midst of change. Their child darted in and out of the doorway, energy uncontained, sometimes carrying small items, sometimes exploring the yard with curiosity. The child's laughter joined the chorus of neighborhood sounds, bright and unself-conscious. For the family, this move wasn't just about a new house. It was about belonging, about planting themselves in a community where they hoped to grow roots. From across the street, on a shaded porch, a man sat in a worn wooden chair. His posture was still, almost too still, as though he had been watching for some time. He was their new neighbor, a white man who lived alone in the small house that had once been filled with voices, but now carried only the echo of his footsteps. The chair creaked quietly as he shifted, though his eyes never left the family across the street. His expression was unreadable. Not welcoming, not hostile, simply guarded, as though he had built a wall behind his gaze. A glass of water sat untouched on the small table beside him, condensation dripping down its side. Forgotten, neighbors further down the street had already made their appearances. A woman with a sun hat had strolled over earlier, offering cookies and cheerful words. Another man waved from his yard while trimming his hedges, calling out a polite, "Welcome to the neighborhood." But this man, the one on the porch, remained silent. His greetings, if they existed, stayed locked behind pressed lips. The family noticed him, of course. It was impossible not to. The father had caught his stare once or twice, offering a polite nod each time. The mother, too, had raised her hand in a brief wave when their eyes met. But no smile was returned, no acknowledgement given. Just the stillness of a figure watching, always watching. From the shade dot, there was something unsettling about it, though nothing overtly threatening. The street was safe, the air was calm, the day was beautiful. Yet in that calm, there was a crack, a subtle undercurrent of tension, like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect song. The kind of tension that makes the hairs on your neck rise, not because danger is near, but because something unspoken lingers. The child, too young to understand such subtleties, didn't notice, but the parents did. They felt it in the silence that lingered after each attempt at acknowledgement, in the way the man's gaze followed their movements, but refused to meet their humanity. They said nothing to each other about it, not yet. For now, there were boxes to unpack, curtains to hang, rooms to fill with laughter. For now they chose hope. And so the sun dipped lower, painting the houses in deeper gold. The father carried the final box inside. The mother wiped her brow with the back of her hand and leaned against the doorframe, watching her child chase the fading light across the yard. The moving truck pulled away, leaving behind the reality of permanence. Across the street, the man on the porch shifted again in his chair. His eyes narrowed, though whether from the sunlight or from something else entirely, it was difficult to tell. His glass of water remained untouched. His expression remained unreadable. And in that quiet neighborhood, as one family settled into their new beginning, another figure sat rooted in the past. Silent and still, the street was calm, but beneath the calm, something unspoken had already begun. The next day, the sun rose bright and unclouded, spilling its light across the tidy row of houses. Morning birds hopped along fences, and the hum of sprinklers filled the street. The family stepped out onto their porch, their faces fresh with the excitement of beginning life in their new home. The father adjusted his shirt collar and glanced toward the quiet figure across the street. The man was there again, seated in the same wooden chair on his porch, as if he had never left it. Summoning courage, the father lifted a hand in greeting. "Good morning," he called, his voice even and polite. The man did not wave back. His eyes flickered toward them, cold and restrained. "You people sure are up early," he muttered, just loud enough to carry across the street. The words landed, heavier than their volume suggested. The mother, standing beside her husband, felt the sting of it. Her smile faltered, though she quickly composed herself. Their child, too young to sense the weight of the man's tone, waved eagerly and called out, "Hi, mister." But the neighbor only turned his head and pretended to busy himself with the condensation on his glass of water. That was the beginning. Over the following days, the attempts at friendliness continued. The mother offered a gentle smile when they crossed paths on the sidewalk. The father made small talk about the weather while watering the lawn. Each time, their gestures were met not with silence, but with sharp, dismissive remarks, cutting away at their efforts. "Don't block the sidewalk with your boxes. You're tracking dirt onto the street. Some of us like peace and quiet around here." The man's voice was steady, never raised, yet there was venom laced in the undertones, the kind that clung long after the words themselves had faded. At first, the family tried to brush it off. They told themselves he was lonely, perhaps simply gruff by nature. But the remarks grew more pointed. One afternoon, while the child played in the yard, their laughter ringing through the air like music, the man's voice cut through the calm. "Keep it down," he snapped from his porch. "This isn't a playground. Some of us don't want to hear that racket all day." The child froze mid-laugh, startled, looking up at their parents with wide, uncertain eyes. The father clenched his jaw, but instead of responding, he called gently, "Come inside for a while." Inside, the mother knelt to comfort the child. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, brushing a curl from their forehead. "Don't let his words steal your joy." Still, in her heart, the unfairness stung. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. Mutters became accusations, whispered loud enough to be heard. I knew this would happen. New people moving in, changing the neighborhood. Property values going down already. Don't they teach their kids manners? The words weren't just insults. They were small humiliations, tiny arrows meant to wound without leaving visible scars. Each one lodged deeper than the last. The father carried the weight silently. At night, as he sat by the window, he would stare out at the man's darkened porch, jaw set, chest heavy with the urge to defend his family's dignity. Yet he stayed silent. He had learned long ago that not every battle was worth shouting through. The mother felt it too. When she hung laundry in the backyard, She sometimes felt his eyes on her, as if her very presence was an intrusion. She would hum softly to herself, willing the tension to dissolve into the afternoon air, but it never fully left. Their child began to notice more than they let on. Once, after being scolded for laughing outside, the child asked quietly, "Mom, why doesn't he like us?" The question pierced deeper than any insult. The mother paused, searching for words that wouldn't poison innocence with bitterness. Finally, she said, "Sometimes people carry hurt that has nothing to do with us. It doesn't mean we're less. It just means we have to be stronger." And so they endured. They chose patience where anger might have erupted. They chose dignity in the face of pettiness. They chose not to let his bitterness dictate their joy. Still, the sting remained. Each remark was like a stone dropped into a jar on its own, small and almost ignorable, but together they filled the vessel, pressing against the family spirit. And though they carried on with grace, the jar was growing heavier by the day. On the surface, the neighborhood remained as peaceful as ever. Lawns trimmed, children playing, the sun spilling gold across rooftops. But beneath that peace, a fracture deepened. The family had come with open hearts, yet they now moved through their days with the weight of injustice pressing invisibly upon them. And across the street, the man still sat in his chair, silent when he wished, sharp when he chose, his gaze never softening. His words were few, but their echo lingered, reshaping the air between the two homes. The family had every reason to lash back, every reason to demand respect. But instead, they chose something harder, restraint. For in their silence there was not weakness, but strength. Strength to rise above the pettiness. Strength to preserve their peace. Strength to teach their child that dignity is not defined by the cruelty of others. And though they could not yet know it, the patience they carried now would soon become the very thing that reshaped the life of the man across the street. As the weeks rolled on, the air between the two houses thickened with unspoken words. The neighbor's hostility had not lessened. His remarks still struck like nettles, but alongside his bitterness, the family began to notice something else. Subtle details. Small cracks in the armor of his disdain. That it began with a limp. One late afternoon, when the sun painted the street in long streaks of orange, the father glanced up from trimming the hedge and saw the man dragging 2 grocery bags from his car. At first glance, it was nothing unusual, but then he noticed the way the neighbor favored one leg, his steps uneven. The weight of the bag seemed too much for him, his face tightening with each movement. Instinctively, the father stepped forward. "Need a hand with those?" he called gently, crossing the street with an open gesture. The neighbor froze, his shoulders stiffening. For a moment, his eyes betrayed something: surprise, perhaps even relief, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He tightened his grip on the bags and barked, "I said I've got it. Don't need your charity." The father hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to insist, but the neighbor's glare made it clear the wall was not to be crossed. So he nodded quietly and returned to his yard. Though the image of that pained limp lingered. Another clue appeared days later, in the middle of one of his angry tirades. The family was in their yard, enjoying a rare moment of peace. Their child was drawing with chalk on the driveway, sketching colorful suns and crooked houses. The mother bent to praise the artwork when the neighbor's voice drifted over, sharp as ever. "Don't you have better things to do than clutter the sidewalk with that nonsense?" But the insult was cut short. A harsh cough overtook him, deep, rattling, relentless. He pressed a fist against his chest, bending slightly as the fit racked. His body, for a moment he looked almost frail, almost vulnerable. The mother straightened, concern softening her face. "Are you all right?" she called, her voice carrying genuine worry. The man straightened abruptly, forcing the cough back into his throat. "Mind your own business," he snapped, before retreating into his house and slamming the door. The sound echoed through the street, but the image remained, A man doubled over by a cough, masking weakness with anger. More patterns emerged as time passed. The family noticed his house was often dark, even when the rest of the street glowed with warm light at dinner time. Curtains remained drawn, shadows lingering long into the night. Once, when the father returned late from work, he saw the man sitting alone in the dark on his porch. No lamp, no sound, just a figure swallowed by shadows, as though he were waiting for something that would never arrive. The mailbox told another story. Envelopes piled up, spilling out from the small metal box until they threatened to scatter across the lawn. Sometimes days would pass before he collected them. When he finally did, he stuffed them under his arm without looking, his limp more pronounced than before. The mother noticed this too. Once, she stepped out with her child and saw a bill flutter from the stack he carried, landing in the grass. She called after him, lifting the envelope. "Sir, you dropped this." He turned, his face half hidden in the shadow of his porch. For a moment, their eyes met, and she thought she saw weariness etched deep into his features, lines of exhaustion that hostility alone could not explain. But then his mouth twisted, and his words came sharp. "Keep it, probably junk mail anyway." The mother lowered the envelope slowly. "I was only trying to help," she said softly. But he had already closed the door. The family began to piece together the fragments. The limp, the cough, the dark house, the overflowing mailbox. Each detail painted the outline of a man unraveling, though he worked fiercely to keep the unraveling hidden. Their child noticed too, in their own innocent way. "Why does he always look so sad?" they asked one evening while helping set the table. The parents exchanged a glance, one heavy with both compassion and frustration. They didn't have an answer. Despite everything, the insults, the cold rejection, the family felt a tug of empathy. There was something broken in him, something far deeper than the surface bitterness he hurled at them. And yet, every time they tried to reach across the invisible line between the two houses, he slammed the door, pulled up the wall, shut out the light. The father, sitting on the porch one night, thought of how easy it would be to stop caring, to let the man rot in his bitterness, to mirror the cruelty with silence. But then he looked at his child, who was tracing shapes in the fading chalk drawings, and he knew he couldn't. He couldn't teach them that compassion had limits, even when it was thrown back in their face. And so the family carried on, noticing, quietly worrying, quietly caring from a distance. Their hearts told them something was wrong, something more than anger, more than prejudice, but he would not let them close. Not yet. And so the mystery lingered, pressing against the golden calm of their afternoons, hanging heavy in the space between one porch and the other. The heat that afternoon was heavy, pressing down like an invisible weight. The sun blazed high, baking the asphalt until it shimmered, and even the breeze seemed to carry no relief, only warmth, thick and unmoving. Lawns that were once lush now drooped under the summer glare, and the air buzzed faintly with the hum of cicadas. The family had just finished lunch. Their child was chasing shadows in the yard, laughing as the sunlight bent behind swaying branches. The mother watered the garden, droplets sparkling briefly before vanishing into the thirsty soil. The father leaned against the porch rail, wiping his brow with a cloth, watching the slow rhythm of the neighborhood as it wilted under the sun's weight. Across the street, the neighbor appeared. He shuffled into his yard, pushing a lawnmower that sputtered and rattled with age. His shirt clung damply to his back, his face already flushed crimson. Each step seemed an effort, his limp more pronounced than usual. The family noticed, exchanging a quiet glance. The father's instinct stirred an urge to cross the street and offer help, but the memory of countless rejections held him back. The mower roared to life, spitting grass clippings into the air. He pushed stubbornly, jaw clenched, as though the task itself were a battle he refused to lose. Minutes passed, the sun climbing higher, the heat bearing down harder. And then it happened. At first, it was subtle, a stumble, a falter in his step. Then came the cough, violent and unrelenting, forcing him to clutch his chest. His hands slackened, the mower veering off course before sputtering to silence. He staggered once, twice, then collapsed onto the patchy grass, gasping for breath. The sound shattered the stillness. For a moment, the street froze. Curtains twitched as neighbors peeked out, drawn by the noise. A man trimming his hedge paused mid-motion, eyes wide. A woman across the street stepped onto her porch, hand over her mouth. But no one moved closer. Instead, some hesitated on their doorsteps, rooted by uncertainty, by fear. One even stepped back, retreating indoors, as though compassion itself had been swallowed by doubt. The family did not hesitate. The father dropped the cloth in his hand and sprinted across the street, his heart pounding with urgency. The mother followed close behind, grabbing her phone as she ran. Their child, frightened by the sudden commotion, stood frozen on the porch, calling after them with worry. "Sir, can you hear me?" The father shouted, dropping to his knees beside the fallen man. His chest heaved in shallow, ragged gasps, his eyes unfocused. Sweat pooled on his forehead, trickling down his temples. His hands clawed weakly at the grass, searching for air that refused to come. The mother's voice was steady, though her hands trembled as she dialed emergency services. "Yes, we need an ambulance. Chest pains, difficulty breathing." "Hurry." The father supported the man's head, loosening the collar of his shirt. "Stay with me. You're going to be all right," he urged. His voice was calm but urgent, the kind of voice that steadies storms. The mother fetched a bottle of water, tipping it gently against the man's lips. He coughed, sputtering, but managed to take a small sip. His eyes flickered open for a moment, meeting hers confusion, shame, and something unspoken swimming in their depths. In those eyes, the family saw flashes of the words he had hurled at them. "Keep it down. Don't lower the neighborhood's value. Don't need your charity." Every insult seemed to echo in that moment, harsh and bitter, a reminder of the walls he had built to keep them out. And yet, here they were kneeling in the grass, steadying his breath, choosing compassion when it would have been easier to walk away. Neighbors lingered on the edges, whispering, their faces etched with hesitation. But it was the family, the very targets of his contempt, who carried him through the storm. The minutes stretched long. The sirens were still distant, but the father's voice never wavered, guiding the man through each shallow breath. The mother's hand rested on his shoulder, grounding him, offering warmth where there had only been bitterness before. Finally, the faint wail of an ambulance began to cut through the thick summer air. Relief swept over the family, though they didn't loosen their hold. When the paramedics arrived, rushing forward with practiced efficiency, the father helped lift the neighbor onto the stretcher. The man groaned faintly, his strength spent, but his gaze lingered on them, on the ones who refused to abandon him. As the ambulance doors closed, the mother reached out instinctively, squeezing his hand one last time. For a brief second, he squeezed back, weak but deliberate. It was the smallest gesture, yet it carried more weight than any insult he had ever spoken. The vehicle pulled away, siren wailing into the distance, leaving the neighborhood silent once more. The onlookers slowly drifted back into their homes, doors shutting one by one, as though eager to retreat from the uncomfortable truth they had witnessed. That kindness had come not from those who stood safely at a distance, but from those who had every reason to turn away. The family stood together. In the quiet aftermath, the sun still blazing, their child pressing close between them. They were shaken, but not regretful. For though his words had wounded them, they had chosen something stronger than resentment. Compassion. And though they could not yet know what would come of it, that choice had already begun to change everything. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and quiet dread, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where every tick of the clock echoed too loudly in the sterile air. The family waited in the hallway, their clothes still damp with sweat from the afternoon sun, their child leaning sleepily against the mother's shoulder. They had stayed long after the paramedics had rushed the neighbor through the double doors, unwilling to leave without knowing what would become of him. Hours passed. Nurses walked briskly down the corridors, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor. A television murmured softly in the waiting area, ignored by everyone sitting beneath its glow. The father sat upright, hands clasped tightly in his lap. His face unreadable, but his mind heavy with the memory of the man collapsing in the grass. The mother stroked their child's hair absent-mindedly, her thoughts circling the same question again and again. Why did he push us away, even when he clearly needed help? Finally, a doctor appeared, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral but calm. "He's stable now," he said. Relief swept over the family in an unspoken wave. It was a cardiac episode brought on by overexertion in this heat. "He's resting, but he'll need to make serious changes if he wants to recover." The family thanked him, their voices soft with gratitude. When the doctor mentioned that the patient had asked to see them, their surprise was evident. For a man who had spent weeks hurling bitterness across the street, the request was as unexpected as it was puzzling. They entered his room cautiously. The blinds were half drawn, filtering the harsh afternoon light into gentle stripes across the walls. Machines beat steadily, measuring each fragile heartbeat. The man lay propped against a pillow, his face pale, drained of its usual hardness. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the authority he wore like armor on his porch. For a long moment, he didn't speak. His eyes flickered between them, lingering on the father, then the mother, then finally on the child peeking timidly from behind her. Shame seemed to hang heavy in his gaze, pulling his features downward. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was rasped and unsteady. "You should have left me there," he whispered. The father stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "We couldn't do that. You needed help." The man's lips trembled, and he turned his face slightly toward the window, as though afraid to look at them directly. His next words came slowly, each one dragged out like it carried the weight of years. "You don't know what it's like. Carrying hate you never asked for. I wasn't always like this." The mother's brows furrowed, her voice gentle. "Then what changed?" Silence stretched, broken only by the beeping of the monitor. His hands gripped the blanket, knuckles pale. At last he exhaled, his words spilling into the room like a confession he had carried for too long. "Years ago, my brother. He was all I had left of family. We grew up in this neighborhood, in that house across from yours. He was the strong one, the one who kept me steady. But then," his voice cracked. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "He was killed. Shot during a robbery. By a black man." The family stood in silence, the revelation cutting through the air like glass. I couldn't let it go," he continued, his eyes wet now. "Every time I looked at someone who looked like him, all I saw was the man who took my brother away. I didn't care who they were, if they were good or kind or innocent. All I saw was pain, so I built a wall. I kept people out. I thought if I hated first, no one could hurt me again." His voice faltered, trembling under the weight of years of grief. "But the truth is, I've been alone ever since. Anger was easier than forgiveness. Bitterness was easier than admitting I was broken, and it ate me alive, day by day, until there was nothing left but this chair, this cough, this empty house." The family exchanged glances, their hearts aching with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. They saw the man now not as the embodiment of prejudice, but as a wounded soul trapped in the shadows of his past. The child, with innocence untouched by bitterness, whispered softly, "But we helped you." The man's eyes closed, tears slipping from the corners. His voice cracked as he replied, "That's what I don't understand. The very people I spent years resenting. You're the ones who saved me." He opened his eyes again, meeting theirs at last. "Why?" the father answered, his tone steady but filled with quiet conviction. "Because hate doesn't heal hate. Someone has to break the cycle. We just chose to be the ones." The room grew still. The man turned his face away again, but not in rejection this time. His lips trembled as though he were holding back words, too fragile to be spoken. At last he whispered, "I'm sorry." It wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. But it was real. The family said nothing more in that moment. Sometimes spoke louder than words. The mother placed a gentle hand on the edge of his bed before leading their child toward the door. The father lingered a second longer, offering a nod that carried both forgiveness and hope. As they stepped out into the hall, the weight of the revelation clung to them, heavy but transformative. The man who had hurled insults from his porch was no longer just a bitter neighbor. He was a grieving brother, a lonely soul who had lost himself in anger. And the twist was clear. The ones he had resented most, the ones he had pushed away, had become the very lifeline that pulled him back from the brink. The days that followed unfolded gently, like the slow turn of a page in a story that had long been waiting to change. The neighbor's recovery kept him tethered to his house and the quiet stillness of his porch. For the first time in years, he was forced to sit, to reflect, to exist without the armor of scorn. At first, he dreaded the silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the old grandfather clock in his living room echoed with loneliness. But then one afternoon, a knock at his door interrupted the stillness. He shuffled slowly, still weakened from the hospital stay, and when he opened it, he found the family standing there. The father held a small basket of fruit. The mother carried a casserole dish covered with foil, and the child clutched a bright, unevenly wrapped card, her smile nervous but hopeful. For a long, awkward moment, the man simply stared. His instinct was to wave them away, to retreat into the comfort of solitude. But the memory of collapsing in his yard, the faces of these very people leaning over him with concern rose unbidden. His throat tightened. He stepped aside wordlessly. Allowing them in, they settled at his kitchen table, the space still marked by years of neglect. The paint on the cabinets had faded, and the refrigerator hummed unevenly. Yet when the mother set the casserole down, the room seemed warmer, filled with an aroma that felt like home. He lowered himself into a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at them. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I don't deserve this." The father shook his head gently. "We don't come because you deserve it. We come because it's the right thing to do." Tears stung the man's eyes, and he blinked them away, ashamed. "I've been cruel to you, to your child. I let my anger blind me. I let it spill over onto people who had nothing to do with my pain." His voice wavered, his chest tightening. "And yet, you saved me. You're here. I don't understand it." The mother reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. Her touch was soft, unthreatening, yet it carried a quiet strength. Sometimes compassion makes no sense, but it can heal things nothing else can. The silence that followed was heavy but not bitter. For the first time, it felt like a silence of possibility. In the weeks that followed, the unexpected bond began to take root. It grew not through grand gestures, but through the small, steady rhythms of everyday life. The child was often the first to cross the invisible line that had once divided their homes. She would wave from the yard, sometimes skipping over with chalk-stained fingers to show him her drawings. At first, his responses were stiff nods, awkward acknowledgments. But soon, he found himself waiting for her visits, his heart softening each time she grinned at him without judgment. The father helped with groceries on days when the limp in the old man's step grew too pronounced. He never spoke of it, never made the help feel like charity. It was always simple: one neighbor lifting a bag, another opening a door. The mother often sent over plates of food, and sometimes she lingered on the porch for a few minutes, chatting. About the weather or the garden. These were small conversations, nothing earth-shattering. Yet each word seemed to chip away at the wall that had once surrounded him. Little by little, the bitterness that had poisoned his days began to loosen its grip. In its place grew something fragile but real: connection. The neighborhood. Notice where once his porch had been a fortress of scowls and muttered insults, it now became a place of quiet greetings. He began nodding at others who walked by, even managing the occasional smile. And the sight of him sitting with the family sharing a meal on a sunny afternoon, or laughing softly at something the child had said, spread through the street like a gentle rumor. People changed in response. The atmosphere shifted. A street that had carried the weight of tension now felt lighter, as though the golden sunlight stayed just a little longer each evening. Some neighbors began to pause and chat when passing. Others, emboldened by the transformation, extended small gestures of their own, sharing garden vegetables, offering help with repairs, inviting one another for coffee. Unity, once fractured by suspicion and prejudice, slowly began to take root. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the houses in shades of amber, the man sat on his porch with the family. The child had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, her curls soft against her cheek. The father leaned back in his chair, watching. The glow of the horizon. The old man's voice broke the quiet. "I spent years thinking this neighborhood would never be the same after my brother died. I thought it had lost its goodness. But I see now, I was the one who changed. I was the one who closed the door." The father turned to him, his voice steady. "And now you've opened it again." Tears welled in the man's eyes, but this time he didn't hide them. He let them fall, the cool evening air carrying the weight of his release. "I can't bring back what I lost, but maybe I can learn to be more than my grief. Maybe I can learn to live again." The mother gave him a soft smile. "And you don't have to do it alone." For the first time in years, he felt the truth of that. The walls he had built around himself were not unbreakable after all. With each act of kindness, with each shared moment, they had crumbled. The night settled in, crickets chirping softly, the air alive with the hum of a neighborhood at peace. And in the quiet of that evening, the man realized something he never thought possible. He was no longer alone. The story of a neighborhood, of one bitter man and one patient family, had unfolded like a mirror held up to the human heart. For years, the old man had chosen to live behind walls of anger. They were not made of brick or wood, but they were higher and colder than any stone fortress. His prejudice had kept him imprisoned. His grief had turned into chains that clanged with every step. He thought those walls made him strong, untouchable. He believed his bitterness kept him safe from the world that had once hurt him so deeply. Yet all it truly did was keep love, warmth, and healing far beyond his reach. And then came the family. They were the very image of everything he had once rejected: black, joyful, full of life and laughter. Their presence ignited the sharp sting of memory, of pain that he could never rewrite. He lashed out, convinced that his cruelty would drive them away, that they would cower or retaliate or simply disappear. But they did not. When their child's laughter was called too loud, they chose patience. When accused of lowering the value of the neighborhood, they chose dignity. Each insult, each dismissal, each attempt to belittle them, they answered not with venom, but with restraint. Not because they were weak, but because they carried within them a strength the old man had long forgotten: compassion. The truth of strength is not found in fists slammed on tables, nor in voices raised to wound. True strength is measured in the ability to hold back when provoked, to choose peace when anger feels easier, to meet cruelty not with its mirror, but with something altogether different. That strength revealed itself on the day the old man's body betrayed him. As the sun scorched the pavement, and he collapsed gasping in his yard, his walls crumbled in an instant. His curses could not save him. His bitterness could not catch his breath. His anger could not call for help. And when the neighbors hesitated, when others stepped back, fearful or indifferent, it was the very family he had scorned who rushed forward. It was their hands that steadied him, their voices that urged him to hold on, their kindness that carried him through the shadow of death. What irony! The world might say that the ones he hated most were the ones who saved his life. But perhaps it was never irony at all. Perhaps it was the quiet design of grace, weaving through the fabric of ordinary lives, reminding us that love has the power to return even to the hardest hearts. At the hospital, as he struggled to speak the truth of his pain, the walls finally broke. He confessed the wound that had shaped his cruelty, the tragedy he had allowed to turn into prejudice, and he wept. Not just for his brother, not just for his past, but for the years wasted in anger. The friendships never formed, the joy never tasted, and the family? They did not leave him in his sorrow. They met him there. They sat with him, not as enemies, not as victims, but as fellow human beings who knew the cost of carrying pain and the weight of being judged unfairly. They offered forgiveness without demanding perfection, and in doing so, they offered him something far greater than sympathy. They offered him freedom. Slowly, day by day, the old man began to live differently. A porch once shadowed by silence became a place where greetings bloomed. Meals were shared. Laughter, once unwelcome, began to echo warmly. The walls of division that had hung over the street like a cloud began to dissolve. A neighborhood that once carried tension now carried hope. All because one family chose kindness when cruelty would have been justified. And here lies the heart of the story. Hate builds walls, but kindness tears them down. We live in a world where anger often feels like power, where bitterness disguises itself as strength, and where prejudice can pass from one wounded heart to another like a poisonous inheritance. But anger cannot heal what is broken. Bitterness cannot fill what is empty. Prejudice cannot bring back what was lost. Only kindness can. Kindness is not weakness, it is courage. It is the quiet defiance of a world that tells us to match hate with hate. It is the choice to stand firm in dignity when others try to strip it away. It is the decision to reach across the gap, to build bridges where walls once stood. The family had every reason to turn away. Every insult could have been an excuse to retreat, every humiliation a reason to close their hearts. No one would have blamed them if they had turned their backs that hot afternoon when the man collapsed. Yet they chose differently. They chose compassion. And in that choice, they not only saved a life but also healed a wounded heart. The old man was not the only one transformed. The neighborhood itself changed. People watched, learned, softened. They began to see that unity was possible, that wounds could heal, that the cycle of cruelty did not have to repeat itself. The echoes of one act of compassion reached farther than anyone could have measured. Forgiveness became the language of the street. And so, the story closes not with bitterness, but with hope. Not with walls, but with open doors. Not with anger, but with love, the kind of love that costs something, that demands humility, that calls forth the truest strength of all. For in the end, true strength is not found in anger or pride. True strength is found in forgiveness.